Hello, I'm Charlotte Critchlow, and the paper I'm going to be looking at is the effects of pro-social cartoons on aggressive cognitions and aggressive behaviours by Zhang and colleagues. I'm going to give you an overview of the paper and intersperse this with my critical review. Just to give you some context to this paper, the social learning model was developed by Bandura, and in his 1961 Bobo doll experiment, he and colleagues demonstrated that behaviour could be learnt by observing and imitating others. More recently, Buckley and Anderson developed their general learning model, positing that exposure to media leads to media-trained behaviour via changes in emotions and attitudes. To date, there's been a lot of research done on the effects of violent media, but very few studies done on the effects of pro-social media. Also, there's some discrepancy in answer to whether pro-social media can affect aggressive tendencies. Some say yes and others are more sceptical. According to the theoretical models we looked at, watching pro-social models should influence children's cognitive and affective states and increase their pro-social behaviours, but the variables that moderate or mediate these effects are less well studied and only in adolescence. So the aim of this paper is to test whether pro-social cartoons can reduce aggression-related tendencies, to compare the effect in boys and girls, and to evaluate the mediating factors between pro-social media and aggressive behaviours. The participants of this study were 174 children aged 5 and 6 from 3 kindergartens in China. The children were divided into 2 equal groups of boys and girls, and the experimental group watched cartoons for 10 minutes a day for 5 consecutive days on the themes of helping, sharing, comforting, and cooperating, while the control group watched nothing. The tests that children performed were firstly the MSCT to test the accessibility of aggressive cognitions, in which they had to react to aggressive images in the fastest possible time, and the CRTT to test aggressive behaviours, in which they delivered a noise blast to a virtual opponent and they picked the loudness. So to critique the methodology, I think that the process used to determine the groups wasn't particularly scientific. Firstly, once divided, they weren't exactly even in their groups in terms of the number of boys and girls, which could slightly affect the results. Also, the participants were nominated for their aggressive behaviour by their teachers and peers. They were asked questions like, who are the bullies in your class? And they had to rank the children from 1 to 10. And I think this would be really hard for children of that age to do with any accuracy. It's very unlikely that the groups were equal to start with in terms of their aggressiveness in each group. There was no pre-testing for the 4 groups, and I think this could skew the results. It would have perhaps been more effective to do a longitudinal study on the same groups before watching the pro-social cartoons and afterwards. Also, although the tests used are considered scientific, I wondered whether they're a true measure of aggressive tendencies in children of this age, because they could instead measure things like reaction time or competitiveness or general cognition. And children of that age have a wide range of abilities and coordination, which could really affect the results, I think. So to test the hypothesis 1 and 2, a 2-way ANOVA was performed, where the independent variables are cartoon watching versus not, and gender, male versus female, and the dependent variables are aggressive cognitions. And this was measured by the reaction time here to aggressive images. A longer reaction time, as you can see in the cartoon watching group, actually equals a lower mean level of aggressive cognitions, which wasn't significant for the girls. In the CRTT, the lower the noise intensity equals less aggressive behaviour, which you can see in the cartoon watching group. The results in both tests were consistent with the first hypothesis, although this effect was not significant for girls. However, contrary to the second hypothesis, after watching the cartoons, boys actually showed less aggressive cognitions and behaviours than girls. These results make us question whether boys are able to adjust their behaviour more readily than girls, or the effect of social modelling is greater for boys, or maybe just that the boys are more engaged in the task or the cartoons than girls. Is disparity of effect among boys and girls a real phenomenon, or is it a result of the testing methodology? Since the results differ from previous studies, and because of the methodological issues that I mentioned, I would be looking to replicate these results. To test the third hypothesis, bootstrapping and a 95% confidence interval were used in this test, And as you can see from this model, the mediation effect of the pro-social cartoons on aggressive behaviours was partially significant, whereas the direct effect was significant. My impression of the paper was that the authors were unbiased and the results were well explained and represented, and the authors used standard scales and appropriate testing, except the consideration that the children may have been too young. So the results show brief exposure to pro-social media decreases aggression in boys, at least in part by reducing their aggressive thought processes. The authors suggest that pro-social cartoons could be used as an intervention in schools or kindergartens to diffuse aggressive behaviours. Cartoon developers could introduce more pro-social content instead of themes that are often not considered violent but have pro-social aggression or combative elements for the greater good, for instance, those with superhero themes. Before introducing these interventions, I think the results need to be replicated in different cultural settings, and more research needs to be done into the differences between boys and girls. It's really important to test whether the experimental and control groups were different at baseline, or perform a longitudinal study to make sure the results are really accurate. You could also play around with the exposure time to cartoons or the time frame of the study. And also researchers need to exclude the children from watching cartoons in their own time before drawing any conclusions. If the results are replicated, then pro-social media definitely could be introduced as part of the early years curriculum or as an intervention in schools, and we should pay more attention to the content available to young children in the same way that we legislate against some advertising for young children. So here are my references, and thank you very much for listening.